A very good evening to everyone. I thank Professor Moitri Chaudhuri, President of Indian Sociological Society, for giving me this opportunity to interview my supervisor and mentor, Professor Bulabhodro. Professor Bulabhodro is a distinguished Indian sociologist and is currently Professor Emeritus and Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies and Research at Sister Nivedita University, Kolkata. She has done her PhD in sociology from McMaster University, Canada in 1986, where she was assistant professor from 1983 to 1986, and taught at the University of Calcutta Department of Sociology from 1989 to 2017. Professor Bhodro has always challenged the established parameters in Indian sociological discourse by espousing an interdisciplinary lens. She is the recipient of Professor D.N. Mojumdar Memorial Gold Medal as Distinguished Social Scientist by Indian Social Science Association in 2017. She has been regional representative and board member of the International Sociological Association's two research committees on gender, women, and society and sociology of childhood. She was also member of the managing committee of the Indian Sociological Society and the convener of the research committee on sociology of childhood and youth RC24 of Indian Sociological Society. Bulabhodro's research spans several important areas in sociology. Her doctoral research, carried out at McMaster University, Canada, focuses on Marxist writings on India and offers a sociological appraisal of the Asiatic mode of production, in which she critiques Marx's views on pre colonial Indian social formation. This early research established her reputation as a scholar deeply engaged with critical theory and historical sociology. She emphasized in her various works of the need for a decolonial critical rethinking and calls for moving beyond Orientalist Europocentric paradigms. She has been engaged with the ways how colonial Orientalist representations have shaped knowledge of India and how India has been imagined. And she invokes indigenous ways of knowing. Her unique essay casts the archetypical Orientalist predicament of sociology on India, published in the first e-journal of Indian Sociological Society 2013, has an iconic status for its strong criticism of colonial biases in conceptualization of caste in Indian sociology. Recently, in a chapter titled Decolonial, Decolonization of Knowledge, Classic Conceptual Follies with Special Reference to India, published in 2025 in the Palgrave Handbook on Decoloniality in India, in Asia. Recently, in a chapter titled Decolonization of Knowledge, Classic Conceptual Follies with Special Reference to India, published in 2025 in the Palgrave Handbook on Decoloniality in Asia, calls for an in-depth study of Indian society, not only from original indigenous sources, but also critical assessment of so-called rational knowledge paradigms of colonizer Europe in case of colonized countries. Her another seminal article is Caste, an Orientalist and Colonial Construct, an epistemological and ontological autopsy, will be published in Handbook of on Anti-Colonial, Post-Colonial and Decolonial Sociologies, edited by Patil, Rushali and Jyoti Puri, Edward Elgar Publishing, USA, spring into 2026. She has profusely contributed to the field of sociology of childhood, and one of her major contributions to the field of childhood studies is as editor of Sociology of Childhood and Youth, Readings in Indian Sociology, Volume 3, published by Sage in 2013. In this volume, she collects, curates, and introduces papers that deal with children, childhood, young people, and youth in India. Childhood and youth have been marginal in Indian sociology, and she pioneered in formulating and introducing a course on sociology of childhood at Sister Nivedita University, Kolkata. She helped to legitimize childhood and youth as serious fields of sociological inquiry in Indian sociology. Central to her work on childhood is the notion of multiple childhood and youths. Another key area of Bulabhadra's research is gender and inequality, with series of remarkable essays on gender technology, surrogacy, and Indian rape laws. Bulabhadra treats gender as a core analytic category in sociology, showing how it shapes and is shaped by technology, globalization, law, and everyday life. She critiques the invisibility of women's labor and rights in mainstream discourse, foregrounds issues like reproductive technologies and surrogacy, and insists on analyzing gender through an intersectional and critical lens. She has to her credit a good number of researched articles in vernacular on gender and childhood. I welcome Professor Bhadro to say a few words now, and then I'll be starting the interview.
Thank you very much, Piali, uh, for such an elaborate introduction. Um, I hope I can justify your so eloquent, elaborate introduction. And let's have the introduction as a president has wished, President of Indian Sociological Society has desired.
Thank you, Professor Bhadro. So, my first question to you is, what inspired you to undertake a critical orientation towards Marxist conception of India, which was earlier not undertaken by anyone?
Well, it was undertaken but not done with justice. That is actually one of the motivating factors. And the second motivating factor is when I went to North America, I found that it's actually better to work on your own country in the way the things have not been done. Because Marx on India or Marx on Asiatic mode of production had few articles only. Some of them were just accepting it. A very one or two article were actually criticizing, but not a full criticism. Now, when I was in Calcutta University doing my master's, we had a small portion on Marx. I remember we used to read Communist Manifesto and also a little bit of German ideology. And when I went to McMaster was that point of time a very known left school. And there are lots of Marxists used to come as visiting, and lots of walks were done uh, on against Marx or his works, etc. But nobody did any work on India or Asiatic mode of production. So I started to look for articles, review of literature, so to speak, that what has been done in Marx and why people do not talk about Asiatic mode of production. So I started reading, and it was a very what should I say, an engaged and tiresome situation reading Marx. So after a while, I decided that whatever cost will be, I will work on Marx. For first, Marx was wrong on depicting India as semi-barbaric, semi uh, village community oriented, and also an eternal stagnation, and which Marx said were only broken by the British colonization. Marx criticized in one of his articles that British is, heinous, committing heinous crimes on India. But still, he appreciated British intervention to India because it was the only social revolution ever heard in the history of India. This particular line actually bothered me, disturbed me, and when I looked at, you know, other articles written on Marx, etc., everybody avoided a criticism of Marx as much as possible. Lawrence Creder, Godelier, uh, and some other new Marxists also wrote, but you know, very vague, not telling what India was. Now, I was a student of history. I had history. In our time, there was 11 classes. So, in the higher secondary examination, I had 200 marks of history. In BA, in Presidency College, my past subject was history. And I was generally interested in history of all countries. Uh, I mean, sometimes instead of storybooks, novels, or something, I used to read history books, even on Europe. So I thought that I should cultivate this since there is nobody actually challenging Marx and he should be challenged. Now, that was the starting of the situation. And as I read more and more from dawn to dusk, and many months I didn't see the sun rose or sunset. I was sort of enmeshed with Marx, so to speak. Even in thinking, I was with Marx. That why did he say that? So I did a small dissertation on Mughal India criticizing Marx in my master's. Then I was also encouraged to do the full thing on Marx. So I started doing that in my PhD dissertation. And in North America, the coursework is very heavy. And there are area examinations, which are not even in Europe or in our South Asia or Southeast Asian countries. Not that I know of. So and there was a compulsory component of whatever you do, you have to learn statistics and quantitative techniques. Now, I remember I was afraid of maths, so I didn't take science in school. But it was all over again, and that I had to learn, I had to take statistics course, extra course even, and learn statistics and quantitative techniques. Of course, for which I'm thankful to McMaster, because then I was able to teach when I was given the assignment of contractual assistant professorship. I was able to teach statistics, quantitative methodology, and some other things. So Marx actually challenged me, or rather Marx's ideas challenged me, that Marx and Engels can never be studied in the face value. And if you are a believer in Marx, doesn't mean that you cannot criticize Marx. To criticize Marx is to take signature with the freedom Marxism actually offers. I'm still a Marxist because I believe the methodological postulates of Marx, which he applied to Europe, are still very valid. And, you know, we can still apply, rectify, etc. But what Marx said on India was exactly like what Aristotle said, that, full of Asia is full of barbaric kings, despotic kings. Then comes Montesquieu, Machiavelli, and of course Hegel. Hegel could not see any spirit in the Asian uh, Oriental world, so that they needed a spirit to develop, capitalism, revolutions, etc., etc. There, Marx was clearly a full Eurocentric philosopher. And when I read Edward Swift, which was published in 1978, and I was in McMaster in 1979 January. So I got the book, read the book without sleeping for 3 days, and I got my clue that Marx was also an Orientalist, and said that clearly. And Said also showed how actually the whole othering conception of colonial anthropology, that they are not us, they are other, and they are not as developed as we are. They are some kind of inferior. So you have the white man's burden to actually elevate them to the developmental path of human society and civilization. And Marx completely supported this position. So I got my clue, my hints that how to critique Marx. For that, I had to do a stupendous task of reading all the original materials in Sanskrit and had to bring them from India through interlibrary loan. I'm eternally grateful to McMaster for doing that. They used to bring me every day 6 books, 365 days. And one of the library, it must be mentioned, which did not send any article or any book or any manuscript, was the Calcutta National Library. National Library said they are in brittle conditions, we cannot send it. But everywhere, whatever there was, even Bhandarkar sent lots of manuscripts. So I started reading them, checking with the English translation. And it was actually, I would say, probably, my good luck that I knew Sanskrit. I read Sanskrit that time. We had in humanities compulsorily either Sanskrit or Hindi. So that helped me a lot in terms of explaining, understanding, and interpreting what the original Indian documents actually wrote. Now, there I discovered that they did not only have private property, which Marx said they did not only have inequality, stratification, and class structure based on ownership of property, and they also have a thriving urban culture. Thriving urban culture means two. One is Indus Valley civilization and Harappa, which nobody knew, and Marx could not have known because he died before that. But the second urbanization, as we call it, in 6th century BC, with Buddha. Buddha as seen by the Westerners as only religious leader, but he wasn't that. During Buddha's time, the mercantile class were actually in the absolute ascendancy, and the king was dependent on the mercantile merchants class. Now, all these things are actually, read by many scholars, but they didn't really bring Marx into it. I brought Marx into it. That Marx's famous documented statement that he doesn't depend on any guesswork. In 1877, he wrote that since I do not leave anything to guesswork, I studied Russian for a long time to read Russian society. And that tells me that Marx then had a double standard, because it was Russia he learned the language. Since it was India, the Orient, he didn't think that he should learn Sanskrit or Pali, and followed the British colonial administrators. My book, which is a revised version of my thesis, when published, I had one satisfaction. A lot of Marxists were actually terrified. None of them could write a critique of it because they didn't know the original materials I referred. And so I think the introduction of my critical thinking, which was probably there in my school, I would think, because we are a Brahmo school, very much influenced by Rabindranath, and Rabindranath provided critique, absolutely. And we read Parrot's Tale in class 10, and that actually influenced me a lot. It still does. And the critical ammunition I had probably in me, which actually, with the help of McMaster's system, not individuals, systems, you know, brought a sort of a culmination of the fact that I was able to criticize Marx. Now, just pause for a moment and think about the situation. I was then only 32 years old when I defended my PhD. And who am I to criticize Marx? This was a question asked to me by one of the stalwart Marxists in McMaster, Marshall Goldstein, saying that, who do you think you are? You have criticized Marx so severely that Marx didn't read this, Marx didn't read that. Then I smiled and said, Marx's motto was, doubt everything. De dubidantum. I followed Marx only. I doubted Marx and criticized him for that reason. The same way Marx criticized Hegel and other ancient philosophers before Marx or contemporary Marx, he criticized severely. Even a colonial administrator, John Butfier, who was posted in Bengal, Butfier called feudalism, saw or witnessed feudalism in Bengal villages somewhere that time. And Marx was very, very offended by that, saying, this ASS calls Bengal system feudal. So Marx was very harsh about his critics. And my answer was, I learned from Marx that I should be harsh with criticism, because nothing is taken for granted, even if anybody writes, Marx or even God. So point is, we check things very critically. Then I quoted C. Wright Mills, that if you are a sociologist, you possess a sociological imagination. There you do two things. Do you understand the status quo so that you can critique it and change it? Secondly, a personal problem gets to be a public issue. Now, Marx saying that India was barbaric, underdeveloped, many other bad phrases, let's not utter everyone. So that was become a public issue because Indians were seen inferior. So I learned this and said back to Marx that Marx is lacking sociological imagination in case of Asiatic mode of production and India. So that is in brief the story of my life in 6 years at McMaster. Almost 5 years, 6 months were troubled. I was actually not supported by my supervisor, and he was mad with me for criticizing Marx the way I did. But I have to give, kudos to McMaster University's Department of Sociology, that even if my supervisor didn't support me, all of them did, others did. They said, since you allowed her to work a critique on Asiatic mode of production, now that she has unveiled the critique and a superb critique, you cannot stop her. So I got my degree and came back to India. Thank you for asking me this.
So, after your harsh criticism of Marx, as we listened to you, how has your research interest evolved over time? Like after your return from McMaster, we see that you have worked extensively on gender. So, why this shift from critiquing Marx to then working extensively on gender?
Yeah, this is a very, very relevant question. Now, truth of the matter is, when I came back, my first task was to publish the dissertation. Um, I failed with major publishers on Marxism because none of them actually want to publish what I have written. Most of them wanted a sort of cut down on this, and I wasn't ready for that. I knew that if it is not published entirely, the point will not be made. So I gave up the foreign authors who gave me the discriminatory treatment, no doubt about it. Then in India also, I found that some publishing houses are really actually, um, you know, not brave enough to publish such a book for the want of loss. So I started looking what I can do. I then started to look for Indological publishers because some people will consider my work as in Indology. There I found quite a reputed publisher that time, Puthi Pustak, which was based in Calcutta, and they published a huge number of this kind of original writing sort of things. So I got the publication in 1989 when I joined Calcutta, and from 1989 to 1992 3, I was criticized from head to toe by Indians that this is a disservice somewhat, and some of course Europeans. And after that, within that period, I was actually demoralized in a sense that if I want to work, then I was planning to work on women's position in from original Indian scripts. I could only do Kautilya partly, but then there are others I wanted to do, but couldn't get the material. And there was another problem: could not go stay somewhere for a long time because you don't get leave, your first year or something like that. Then I thought the years are passing by, and I'm being criticized. One or two praise came, but criticisms were more. Praise came actually after 1996, 97. Lots of praise came in. One of them was an Australian Marxist, Macfarlane, quite known. He said Mulabhadur drove a cannon to Marxist theory of Asiatic mode of production. So anyway, then I started two things. Feeling very demoralized, and another mishap happened in my life. My mother died in an accident in 1990. So from all sides, I felt some kind of, what should I say, absolutely cornered. And the university I joined, first I joined Vidyasagar University 1987 to 1989, Political Science Department, where I was cornered. In 1989, when I joined Calcutta, I was cornered. I was the American scholar, so-called, who only understands American thing. That was some of my teachers' idea at that point of time, because I was teaching in class critical things, not giving notes, not telling them that how many they have to, 6 or 7, not teaching them 6 or 7, but the whole syllabus of 20 or 22 topics. So all these things combined, I would think that some students and some teachers didn't like me. So the first year was not a very pleasant one, and with my mother's passing away, It was a terrible one. But I decided that, I have to work. I cannot stay this way. But this was a critical juncture in my life. I decided two things. I will write in Bengali some of the articles because my second preference was always gender. If I couldn't have worked on Marx's Asiatic mode of production. So I will write in Bengali so that, you know, it gets to the wider people of Bengal and maybe side by side a consciousness raising. You can think 1990-91 was a very incipient phase for gender studies in India itself. So I actually decided to do that. And secondly, I decided that I should work on gender and write in English. So these are the turning points, I think, that I decided to write in Bengali, that too in gender, and in English also in gender. I tried to write articles like, what in Bengali, then some part of it in English, so that there is a, that actually went on up to 95-6. Some I have written some, but not to the satisfaction. Then I started teaching criminology, special paper in Calcutta University. And I saw that there is very little proper work on women and crime or crime against women, and not in Bengali also. That then caught my attention, and I started writing then on gender. And I started to look at the theoretical framework of gender. People are saying, and these many people are, only survey method was popular and quantification of it. That women has qualitative life, there is something to listen to from them, was not then popular in India at all. And this comes from my studies in feminist theories in McMaster again, that I understood that knowledge has to be given in a way that is valid, not just temporarily, but so for that you need theory. So I started to depend on feminist methodology, standpoint theory, specifically Dorothy Smith, and then other feminists also, providing critique of liberal feminism. I never was a liberal feminist, either radical or minus, Asiatic European Marxist feminism. That taught me a lot, feminists. Actually, feminists are the one who never actually took Marx or Marxists for granted. Because whenever new Marxists talk about gender, they talk about in a general way as if, all working class men and women suffer same. Not true at all. Working class women suffer double because they do double days work. One is unpaid, and you do not have recess, so to speak. When you work in a factory, there are recess. But when your baby cries 11 o'clock at night, you can't say to your baby that I am on a recess. So I understood that this kind of critical understanding in gender is lacking. And I started with critique of law, which I continued quite some time. That in India there is a conception. Now the conception is actually, shattering. That if you have a law, you can do justice. That is a false premise for any feminist. Liberals did not understand. Liberal feminists asked for feminist. So in India, we followed them. We also asked for a legal reform. Some legal reforms we got in the 80s and we were very happy. Golden age, etc. But we forgot that how much is being translated in action is not being seen properly. There I have made a breakthrough and started to do what we call in our feminist circles narrative analysis. So I started to interview the women as not question answer or structured questionnaire, because feminists can never do with structured questionnaire. Feminists must have a worldview of their own, and the researcher on women must have the women's narrative from morning until the night. So I started that with domestic violence, and legal reform failed in curbing domestic violence. That time I was not taken also seriously, that Professor Bhadro again criticizes legal reforms. Don't you want legal reforms? I've been asked this question in umpteen number of seminars, etc. Then I said, I want legal reform, of course, but I also want them to be effective. They are not effective. And we had this, what should we say, very strenuous interaction. And they are 9 and I am 1 or 1.5 people supporting me. That you are very critical and you are sort of I said, no, you're doing things in the wrong way. You must see where law comes from, how law is promulgated. See, there is a problem with the Indian sociology. I'll say it still is. Forgive me, my superiors, others, and my cohorts. We read history much less. If we have read history properly, we would have known that Europe had the same village communities as India did. All countries in that period had village communities. That was a world development, not India alone. We read history much less. We don't know our own history. If you ask somebody that you know about Harappa, the sociologist will look at you. But Harappa was one of the developed civilization of the world, first urban civilization, hugely advanced in technology. So the problem with me and others would have, where I became rather cornered, loner as a sociologist, that I always said, as Professor Shu explained so nicely, that I have an interdisciplinary lens always, because I believed that without knowing some other subjects, you can never explain a social phenomenon. If you don't know the history or the politics of it, you cannot say it. So that was one of the major reasons I transferred to gender and thought that I will be doing good work by having a rigor. If I work, I will have a rigorous feminist methodology, combining qualitative with quantitative and historical and narratives, which is very popular now. We are calling them for the last 10-15 years mixed methods, and they are very popular now. I thought of that time, but I was very, very severely criticized that, women will always say men are bad. But women didn't. Women talked about their constraints of feelings, that how the mother feels when she has to go to the work, but the child is crying. But people had perception, or rather fear. Patriarchy is embedded with fear that the patriarchal control might be loosened. So I was in 90s only. Now we are in 21st century, 2025. You can imagine that time telling about gender, these kind of things was not popular. One thing is very important to me, or rather it is part of my activities. I'm never in the mainstream. I'm thinking earlier and trying to establish it, and then getting lot of rough weather. And in the end, I could see now people are following that. Thank you, Pial.
Uh, Here you are speaking about taking an intersectional approach to the study of gender, which you did long back. Now we really practice from an intersectional approach. So I would like to know what do you consider as your most important contribution to the sociology of gender?
Now, this is a troubled question. If I say one, then I'm meaning my other article. I wouldn't do that. I would give you the here quantitative criteria might be the point. I'm naturally a member of the ResearchGate, and ResearchGate has all my articles, etc. ResearchGate gives you a weekly report, and from that I could see two articles are contesting in terms of gender with each other. One is precarious surrogacy, the umbilical cord between the digital and the uh, crime. I would consider surrogacy a crime in the sense that how India sold women's womb by paying peanuts to them, and the foreign couples came. They choose the woman skin color, eye color, figure, etc., physical test, and she was sold to the highest bidder by the middleman, the doctors who actually practice this. So I would consider myself surrogacy because I was invited to a meeting in Pune where the central ministers that time came in, and I spoke about against surrogacy, gave a long keynote, and the health minister that time came to me and told that we will see that it stops. And of course, a bill was brought, but there was some problems with other parties, etc. And finally, the commercial surrogacy is actually uh, illegal, declared illegal. But it has not stopped, it has reduced because there is a long history of child selling to Middle Eastern countries, to other countries, and then selling in the market that, white skinned Indian woman, etc. So it's going on, but much reduced rate, and no media reports it. But it's on. If you go to the independent freedom medias, you'll see it's going on, but much reduced rate. And the next fashion is that film stars started to have surrogate babies with the relatives. Now that cannot be stopped. Um, that's going on. Even Priyanka Chopra did it sitting in America, where surrogacy is banned in most of the states except one or two. That too very conditional. So I consider surrogacy, but at the same time, the article on rape law reform is also read very widely, and it's read globally. And surrogacy is now in the United Nations. Uh, United Nations actually launched a program saying the working class position in so-called former colonies, and also the women's situation. Surrogacy is listed there as a precariat class because, see, surrogate women as if were classless. No, the concept of precarity actually, which I applied to that is lot referred as I considered surrogate as precariat, and that has been actually uh, quite a bit popular in terms of citations, etc. So I would say, looking at the statistics of the ResearchGate, it is surrogacy, precarious surrogacy, and then rape law reforms. The last one, I have actually 3 articles on that. The last one, which I wrote on Nirbhaya, after Nirbhaya, and the committee which was formed by Verma committee, and they gave lots of good recommendations. Government didn't accept totally, and still the rape conviction rate is low. And secondly, a new trend has developed. I hope I can write another article on that. Point is, now rape is no longer rape plus murder. Most of the victims are murdered now after rape. especially gang rape. And that has gone up like anything. And I haven't seen feminist writings on this one in India. Maybe you all can take up one.
Okay, Professor Bhadro, you were speaking of the the precarious labor. Did this somehow lead you to explore childhood as a distinct area of sociological inquiry? We would like to know what made you shift to childhood, because here surrogacy is also linked to having babies. So, we would like to know about your journey from precarious labor to childhood as area of sociological inquiry.
Let me profusely thank you that being such an avid reader of my writings and my growth, etc. Uh, Not really surrogacy. What struck me when I interviewed women for domestic violence, rape victims, molestation victims, etc., then most of the time the woman would be seeing me either when her husband is not there, or sometime outside in a cafe or a restaurant, something. And those who had children, small, they used to bring them. Or whenever I'm interviewing her in her home, the child would stay nearby. I would tell her that she should not listen some of this. Then she said nothing I could do. She doesn't want to stay alone. That gave me an idea that even in upper middle class, children are very alone because their numbers are there are hardly any siblings. If there is a sibling, then it's a different one. And the child, everywhere when I saw the child with mother, I felt that the child is not happy. Uh, Means that somewhere there is something wrong. Or her mother would say, go do this home task, homework, etc. And she would dislike, and he would also dislike. The same kind of feeling I got. And when I went to people where they have teenagers, the dissatisfaction in the teenager, the helplessness in the teenager attracted my attention very deeply. So you could say that work on gender actually led to me another group of people who are not really happy with their life, or feel somewhat lonely, etc. From there, I started looking at the teenagers first, because it was easy for me to get teenagers. And what they revealed to me was something really I can never forget. That they would say after 2 days, I made a series of interviews that the teenagers should feel, free. But in front of parents, they never felt free. Very few, 1% or so. And they used to tell me, whisper me, give me small notes that come on that day, mom and dad will be out. So that day they told me so many things that I was surprised that the stress, the tension, the dissatisfaction of the system of growing up, and they are all Calcuttans. So I decided that I should work on this also. And when I started to work on parenting and question parents, they were also very much, uneasy to speak. To begin with, I detected the problem, that the problem is rooted in parents, not in children. So I should actually have a study on parenting. My first study of parenting of 30 parents in Kolkata told me that they know nothing about parenting, 100% of higher middle class. Then I came down to the next stage. They also have no money, but there are constraints that. And when I started to interview lower class women, working class women, including the housemaids, etc., I saw that they are little more understanding about their children than the middle class. Because why? They are not in a rat race to make you like upper middle class or middle class to make engineer, doctors, these, that, which they are not. And also having high marks, which they never had. I had to ask parents that have you ever got 80%, 90% in your school? The answer was in our time 60% was good enough. So we got 60%. Then I said there was no one in 70. No, there was, but what I'm saying is, she doesn't study, he doesn't study, my daughter doesn't study. Then comes mobile, etc. I did a detailed work on UGC project on digitalization of leisure and young people. So interestingly, I became involved with the working on children, youth, teens. And I found out that there is no single way to say, like, this is parenting, 1, 2, 3, 4. No. You must be absolutely having one thing which you can say that, try to understand them, be on their shoes. That's all you can say. And then you have to devise that how you will deal with your children. And this idea was totally absent, completely absent in Kolkata. I studied a few couples in Durgapur, Holdia, Bardhaman. I didn't get one. Not a single couple actually were knowing about what is parenting. I know a very important, a colleague of mine, professor, he said, you're wasting time with this. What is parenting? I said, that's what I'm trying to discuss with you. Well, there is parenting. Did my parents know about parenting that you're talking about it? Then I said, did your parents or your father use computer? No. You use it every day. So why are you saying this? Being a professor? He was mad with me for a long time. I realized that it has nothing to do with formal knowledge or degree. It has to do with a lot of empathy. That you have to be in your child's shoes to understand what he or she is facing. I'm often criticized that I have not actually pressurized my daughter to get lots of marks. And if I would have pressurized, I told someone that if I would have pressurized her, she would not have got probably what she got and feel negative about her. See, what we do not understand in parenting, which needs to be told, and even, that is why with my Provident Funds money after retirement, I developed Bondhu, the organization. Mainly we did parenting, So that's why I consider myself that I'm an activist also. So obviously, childhood captured my imagination, taking it from gender. And I saw that we need to tell that United Nations, UNCRC, is not ours to follow. But any criticism of UNCRC was met with anger. Even in my introduction in the Sociology of Childhood by Sage, I criticized UNCRC, but not to follow UNCRC. Because this Child Right Convention is completely based on European model. An European model They are not similar also, but there is no chance of diversity in that. Amendments were brought, but didn't actually. And in case of India, absolutely not. So I proposed multiple childhoods. And by the way, multiple childhoods is also read as research reports. But the tragic part of it is read much less in India. It's read elsewhere much more. So when I say multiple childhoods, my Indian cohorts are not ready to accept it now. They will though, but may not see it. They will. Because the crisis in childhood and teenage, and with the unemployment we have now in India, they will just pressurizing and saying that you get this much 90%, 95% engineering BTech are unemployed. Now, what will you do now? Now you are talking of a better lens, newer skills, holistic ones. So obviously, people will. And is child an individual in India? No, not yet. That has to come too. So even educated parents, not all people read sociology of childhood. So even educated parents, formal education that is, do not understand their child. Now a trend is coming up, as I said, it will, that some people are not imposing, I want you to be engineer, doctor, these, that, so and so. You want to be a singer. I want to be a dancer, an artist. So parents are accepting this. Otherwise, there will be tremendous, breakdown between parents and children. And I had to fight in Indian Sociological Society, tooth and nail, to establish this research committee in 2012. And I was not supported realistically. But finally, I got it after 2 years of, fighting, etc., that there should be a sociology of. I actually wanted two separate committees, sociology of childhood and sociology of youth. Couldn't get that. I hope you people can make understand Indian Sociological Society that there should be two research committees interlinked. All research committees are interlinked, but childhood needs separate concentration, youth needs separate concentration, but not delinking with each other, linking with each other. In fact, if you do not link stratification with childhood or youth, don't make any sense. Because you have to know their economic position. Absolutely. There is a lot to be done on childhood. Lots and lots. Indian sociologist hasn't come out with lots and lots of work. So I would hope future generation, if this is archived and future generation listen to this, they will try, which I couldn't do. I did establish the research committee, but I could not, inject so much so that there is people writes on it.
Thank you, Professor Bhadro. Well, you legitimized childhood as a serious field of sociological inquiry. But what are the problems did you face in your universities in gaining recognition for areas like childhood, or for that matter, gender? Uh, at that time, gender, nobody was doing any research on gender, as far as I know, being your student back in 1990s. So, what are the problems did you face in your university, and in both areas, in opening courses on gender or childhood? Well, you opened sociology of childhood at, as we know, at SNU Kolkata, but what challenges did you face in University of
See,
Calcutta?
University of Calcutta Department of Sociology, except Professor Bela Dattagupta, whom I didn't get. She retired that time. She was my teacher in masters. Uh, it's a tradition. It was a traditional department, quite a bit of traditional department. So I could not open either sociology of gender or sociology of childhood at Calcutta University in my 28 years of teaching and research there. What I did was, again, I was called aggressor. I smuggled topics, issues within their traditional syllabus. Since you are all my students, you know that nobody taught you Orientalism or Europocentrism, Soed, or these things before I came. And similarly, gender was, issue of gender, women, crime, etc., correctional homes, women. I also just taught, syllabus being whatever the syllabus is. Kolkata being Kolkata, I had lots of grievances against me by faculty members that I'm not following syllabus. I said, your syllabus is dated. I wanted to introduce writing term paper and book reviews. I was thoroughly opposed. Even I was told that, the carbon dioxide which comes out of me is American. And I inhale American oxygen. I haven't got any scientific theory on that, but I had heard that in early 90s that what the hell is this? Pre-colonial India was never existence. A.R. Desai, one chapter, and then India. India didn't exist in sociology syllabus. I mean, original India. Like that, gendered violence didn't exist. Crime against women didn't exist. And so many things didn't exist because it was not in the syllabus. I decided to rebel. I will introduce these things even if they are not in syllabus. What happened is when UGC made gender compulsory, late 90s, early just 2000, then also Calcutta University Sociology did not make gender, sociology of gender a course. But I became free to teach whatever I want. So interestingly, I should say McMaster stands as a positive catalyst for my type of sociology. University of Calcutta Sociology Department stands as a negative catalyst for not introducing recent things. Sorry, I'm harsh on my department, not on my students, but on the department. My students have been really wonderful from the very first year to the last year, as they didn't also listen about this thing and actually were with me in terms of working on gender, crime, childhood, etc. So I have a lot to thanks, lot of thanks, lot of my indebtedness go to my students. Not only doctoral scholars of course, but also the students who took the special paper with me, crime. And there we did whatever we wanted to do. And that is now recognized. I can see in Calcutta syllabus a touch of me here and there. Orientalism is there. Isn't it, Piali? Do you know in your Jadavpur syllabus it is there?
Yes. We have also sociology of gender also.
Right.
and
So,
sociology of childhood.
childhood. So I would say that I didn't succeed. When we opened MPhil in 2007 or 5, something like that, uh, I used sociology of gender in MPhil, but not in masters. So it's an interesting story in the sense that I did one of the very highly valued seminar in 2007 as 150 years of University of Calcutta's birth, and we had one of the best seminars, luminaries from India and abroad, on childhood. An interesting position is that students were interested, other people were interested, but you cannot open it. See, it depended on majority. I'm never a majority person, so I could not open it. When I went to SNU gave me a free hand, and I opened gender, childhood, sociology of technology, science, technology, all these things which I wanted to do in Calcutta. But Calcutta gave me, as I said, a challenge. Department of Sociology was a challenge for me every day, and I did what I wanted to do in the end. They, whoever is, could not prevent me. Calcutta is traditional, but the students who come to Calcutta are not traditional. So that was the leverage point which I missed at SNU. I loved SNU's freedom, but I missed my Calcutta students. They are still the best gift in my life.
Thank you, Professor Bhadro. Now, uh, we would like to again go back, travel back, not much actually, but you always uh, concluded that caste is an Orientalist and colonial construct. What made you come to that conclusion? Because stating that caste is a colonial and an Orientalist construct was uh, talks about your uh, orientation. So I said that going back, where you had criticized Marx because of his Orientalist thinking. So if you can elaborate on this.
Okay, this is my second favorite, but I'll try in brief. See, when I read history, Indian history, um, I never got the word caste in Indian any original text, treatise, or uh, um, coins, uh, pillars, etc. You can't find the word caste. And that actually struck me uh, while I did my PhD. But that time it was impossible to also do caste at the same time. So afterwards, I started looking again um, in terms of where did the word came from. In fact, in 1993, I came across a book, Declan Quigley, a British anthropologist. Uh, there he is this guy talking about Ronan Inden and others, Marriott and Ilnen. And there they said that caste is a Portuguese word. Casta was the Portuguese word meaning pure. I was very, very, enthusiastic that then my suspicion is correct that caste is not an indigenous Indian word. Then I started to look into the caste's original uh, places. The article which is coming out in 26, that will have a detailed one, and Palgrave Macmillan Handbook also has some a portion on that. Now the point is, in 1952, Srinivas wrote an article which was very important, that if you think caste is Varna, then please don't tell me. He was very irritated. And what happened is, I started to look at caste. Actually, the problem with sociology of India is that it was very much anthropologically dominated. And Srinivas also very much under the influence of anthropology, especially social anthropology, wanted an union between sociology and social anthropology. But that apart, that caste is not Varno, Srinivas was very clear. But as usual, it was not read until people started to make questions. What is caste? Where did it come from? Simple. There is to be called Iberian Wall between Portuguese and Spanish. And there were fights between Jews, old Jews, new Jews, and who is pure, who is not. And purity concept is also there in feudal Europe. Portuguese people, Jews, they are not pure. Some Jews are pure, etc. So there was a fight, and inquisition started, that who is pure, who is not. Now, Vasco da Gama landed in the shores of India in 1498. And in 15th century, actually, there is who is pure, who is not debate went on. There are books about that. And at that point of time, the travelers are coming to India. It was Mughal India. Jahangir's reign in 1605, Thomas Roe came in from England. So whatever they are seeing in India, they think that it is a purity pollution complex, which Dumo picked up and didn't try to actually rather superimpose that it was caste and other. But I'm not going to do more. I'm just saying, you can read it from my article. I'm just saying that the caste was never in India because the word doesn't exist. So the word came in around 18th century. Why? Because British codified caste in the census as the main category. And how many castes were reported in 1901? More than 2,000. Remember, British stopped caste census. And because more than 3,000 castes were reported, you should read Barnard Cohn. People should, in India, people should read Barnard Cohn, a historian. Name of the book is The Historian Among Anthropologists, an anthropologist among the historians, something. Chicago School, Barnard Cohn, these people showed long back, and we were never known, never taught that the word caste is a Portuguese word. And jati doesn't mean anything, means occupation. 65 occupation reported in 6th century AD. So obviously, if somebody reads Barahami, Brihad Sankita, now this not read, and then we have this, notes for Indian history. There we didn't discuss, we accepted caste as British. Like the word Hindu, there's no word called Hindu. It is the river Sindhu, and Iranians could not pronounce S, so Hindu, and Greeks couldn't pronounce S, so it became Indus. Megasthenes wrote Indica. Civilization was called Indus Valley Civilization. People don't read history. That's why I said, if you think it is history, if you think it is sociology, historical sociology, which needs to be read, as part of our syllabi. The pedagogy must change. There we bring with the caste. I bring in criticism of caste. I bring in the decolonial pedagogy. And we must understand that a little bit, that how other people, other means even Philippines, South Korea, Latin America, full Latin America, Spain and Portugal's colonies, and of course those who came from Spain and from Argentina, Brazil, etc. They are now in American universities as professors. Peruvian sociologist Quizano first gave this concept, decoloniality and coloniality. Then Walter Mignolo added this. So, what is coloniality? Colonialism is gone, but we are still using colonial concepts. Classic is caste in India. See, caste may be a phenomenon, maybe, in independent India, which was introduced by British, 3000, 2000, whatever. Let's see. There will be caste census again following British, and see how many castes are reported. But what you got in original material is 3 Varnos, not 4. 3 Varnos, Brahman, occupation is this, Kshatriya occupation, and Vaishya. 10th edition, 10th Ved's 10th position. That means those who will be laboring, Shudra comes in. But there was no provision in owning properties, etc. So obviously, we did not read at all. Now we are talking IKS, IKS. What is IKS? Pedagogy hasn't changed. Pedagogy has to be changed. Doesn't mean we are bringing back goddess. Means we bring back what were there actually. So obviously, I have considered my task while criticizing caste and jati. Jati is a flexible category. Bete told us that jati is like an elastic. As many people, as many jatis. So obviously, while doing these things, I was led to this decolonization, which was there in me always, and decoloniality. And now that's, my task. The rest of the years I'm alive and well, that to show that how decolonization of knowledge is very important and how we should understand pedagogy in decolonial terms. So if we continue with coloniality, if we think British gave us freedom, then actually we are not at all free. It is coloniality. And there are umpteen number of works have been done, but 1 or 2 from India. Well, I'm running this international series on decolonization of knowledge and decoloniality, decolonial pedagogy, looking back and moving forward. That means I'm looking back, what is there, and then I have to move forward. And the international scholars who are, giving lectures online, of course it is online, it's in a hybrid, blended format. Everyone is telling about this position. And we must understand that we are lagging behind. And if we still think we do caste census, and we are still divided by caste, then I would just like to ask one simple question. How many castes? We know in 10th and 11th century, Brahmins were divided, Kulin and non-Kulin. Then comes Barendra Brahman, another type. 200 types of Brahmins during Ballal Shen, 11th century AD. So then how many type of Shudros now government of India, independent India created, then adding it, First scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, then comes other backward classes, every day increasing. People are poor. They are poverty stricken. And Indians still do not have a square meal, needed nutrition calories. All Indians do not still have. And we are talking caste. Ridiculous. We should actually have poverty and non-poverty. So obviously, see how coloniality continues in us. 227 census has been declared on the basis of caste. For many people, they don't know caste. As Barnard Cohn reported long back, that British Sahib used to go with a half translator, knows little English, and so he will translate whatever he thinks. Then he will sit under a banyan tree because of the sun, and translator guy would bring people, and whatever he translates, Sahib used to note that. And that is known as British how created caste, codified it, enacted it. You cannot show one king talking in terms of caste. You can show kings giving Brahmins lot of things, Kshatriyas lot of things, but not caste. Because there were Brahmins and Brahmins. There are poor Brahmins, historically attested. In Gujarat, Shatashudras were rulers. But alas, Indian sociology students, do they read that? The answer is probably no. Maybe 1%. That too I do not know. Because the pedagogy hasn't changed. It is the same colonial pedagogy. So I believe by launching the critique on caste and so-called tribe, because tribus is a Latin word, came from Rome. Why? Because Romans were defeated by tribes, Goth, Visigoth, Vandals. There is a Hollywood movie, Rise of Fall of Roman Empire. 3 hours. At least that can be seen, showing the tribal uprising, so-called, why they were called tribals. And British borrowed that. And in India, everybody who is not, knowing English, poor English sahib or clerk, is a tribal almost. So tribal. They were poor people. As if there are no poor Brahmins. This is actually a kind of deception British did. And we did not protest it. And that is Indian sociology, never protesting that sociology did not start with Koth or Durkheim or Saint-Simon. There is enough sociology in Kautilya. There is enough societal analysis in Kautilya. And then you go on. British only knew there was a Monu. No one Monu, there were several Monus. That also British didn't know. And we also say Monu said it, Manusmriti. That Manusmriti prescribes hugely for private property and the conditions of getting private property and losing. That is not taught, not talked about. Because nobody has seen Manusmriti. They just heard. Our knowledge is hard at the moment. We haven't studied our own society. That is precisely my objection to the mainstream sociology in India. That it talks about only present, as if in the past we didn't exist. We started to exist from 1757, Plassi's Battle of Plassey. So Indian sociology must take a back turn. Looking back, then you can move forward. And I strongly would disagree with the mainstream sociologist on India that there is caste.
What are your key insights in applying this decolonial approaches to sociology?
To know your own country better apply methodologically history in order to study any society, any social formation, any organization. And methodology must be mixed, historical, and then in another way, if it is a present day phenomenon, it will be always mixed methodology, so that we can cover as much part of the reality we can. And decolonial studies are key to understanding coloniality and colonialism. Without them, you cannot understand. Until and unless we understand what happened from 1757 to 1947, we are actually missing what happened from 1947 to 2025. We are not connected then. Again, we are missing from 2500 BC, from Harappa, Mohenjo-daro to 1757, what we were. If we don't know what we were, how can we know where to go? Indian sociology has been very ahistorical. I don't know of any university which say historical sociology course. I don't know. Maybe it is my ignorance. So far, I know there is none. Why is history not taught? Why is history not taught as compulsorily, properly? How many people have read Irfan Habib's Mughal India? Actually, very few. It's a 700-page book. And how many people have read Ramcharan Sharma, Indian Feudalism, Materialist, a basis of ancient India? We don't read them. As sociologists, we read August Comte. Why don't we read our own materials and also theirs? I have no objection in reading so-called European sociology, that too West European, basically. And reading my own country also. Why wouldn't we read? I mean, it sounds like a political propaganda, but not. Because I don't think there is any Hindutva or Hinduism possible. The word is a British makeup. They decided that since we now can have Hindu, after 13th century people, Hindustan meant where Hindus live, not as a religious group. That was made by British in the 18th century and then applied in 19th century and before they go. And we accept it. Ambedkar thought that it will be 10 years for reservation, but Ambedkar didn't know and never thought that reservation will continue. And reservation becomes a key political weapon for the political parties. We don't teach properly. Our syllabus is not proper, and that is the problem. That means we are giving a pedagogy which should be discarded. Why don't we compulsorily learn Sanskrit? Why? Or Pali? Why not? Or even later stage Tamil? Because South India has tremendously developed states, Chol, Chalukya, Pallava. These were actually hugely developed, but we know nothing about them. That's the problem. See, if you don't know where you are coming from, what your father did, your mother did, you cannot really think of much. Then we will say they are absolutely orphan. We are orphan in a way that we don't study our own legacies. How could India do what India did if we do not know? The policy's result is source of a conspiracy, which has happened everywhere. And if we think Europe, but we are mesmerized by European things. Do you know what Europe is? What European history has offered? Or is there a European history? what kind of things they had in 5th century AD, in 6th century AD? No. We just imagine they had something. When we have created demigods, demiurges, for the coloniality, and colonialism is, long formally gone, but the coloniality exists with its supreme power, power over our mentality. We cannot think without being. That's why we are not progressing. What we are doing is going back. We keep going back, never moving forward. That's why the title is Decolonization of Knowledge and Decolonial Pedagogy, Looking Back and Moving Forward. I hope in the last days of my life that I can take this battle to its fullest. I don't know. I would request future generations that they must take this one and establish that we were not barbarous, semi-civilized, semi-barbaric. And don't read A.R. Desai's that chapter. A.R. Desai, with all due respect, was a historical sociologist. I know after listening to this, I don't know whether the full one would be, given as recorded one. A lot of people will get mad at me. It doesn't matter to me. I am, from the beginning to the end, grateful and faithful to my country, India. India, that is Bharat. You know why preamble has this first sentence? It was the kingdom of Bharat. By Bharat, the king. Bharat, B-H-A-R-A-T. And Bharat, B-H-A, umlaut on the top of A, R-A-T, Bharat. India, that is Bharat. So I am only loyal to that, not to sociological traditions anywhere. I'm still the unconventional person I was, probably now more.
As we wrap up, I'll be asking you the last question. What methodology do you recommend for research?
If I want to say in one word, mixed. Because every part of reality has qualitative, quantitative, and something more. And if you are actually working on marginalized people, downtrodden peoples, you must have their narratives as essential part of adding to qualitative and quantitative aspects. I don't think that reality can be understood from one point of view, one side. It has to be understood from many aspects. So I would always refer to mixed methodology, and with that also, I will refer that one should have minimum understanding of what we call international, interdisciplinary studies: history, political science, philosophy, statistics, physics, chemistry. Because if we do not understand physics, we may not understand our own philosophy. See, Indian philosophy only read by those who take philosophy. But we have more than 200 Upanishads. We have logical school, we have Lokayato, materialist school, we have Nyaya, we have Mimamsa. Probably sociology hasn't even heard their names. Let's stop following and let's do something which will actually tell the real story, the true story of India, which is only partially told yet. So I will actually request the next generation of students who may be hearing this. I'm not sure, because whether Indian Sociological Society can bear my rebellious attitude to Indian sociology. One Indian sociologist I will highly recommend that everybody should read. His name is Binoy Sarkar. positive background of Hindu sociology. One must read Vinay Sarkar in order to be an Indian sociologist on India. Rest is your choice, but I would request the future generation to read about India from the beginning. At least have an idea of it. Otherwise, how do you know? The word development is a problematic word because it was created during 19th century, came into existence in 17th. The moment it came in, we became developing, underdeveloped, then Asia, Europe, now global North and global South. These stupid ideas, sorry for my language. Who is global South? Australia, New Zealand, Japan. But geographically, they are global South. And who is global North? Peru, Colombia. See, this is knowledge is the highest weapon in the hands of those who actually rule, those who have power. Foucault told us, if Marx told us, in fact, every philosopher of repute have told us that power is the important thing. That is why Barnard Cohn, in his last days, wrote a book called Colonialism as Knowledge. And all of us should read that. I don't understand why we don't read these in every subject. Now UGC is telling this, so let's do it. Now that the UGC has come into some kind of senses, let's do it. Let's read all these briefly, at least to have a interdisciplinary real view. Thank you, Piali. I hope the interview is taken every word of it, because I meant every word of it.
Thank you, Professor Bhadra, for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. We really appreciate your time and your thoughtful responses, and this conversation is actually very, very valuable for our research and learning, and your perspectives have given us a deeper understanding of the topics we have discussed today. Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor Bhadra.
Thank you very much.